Hello and welcome to the Vaults of Terra. My name is Ed and today we're going to be continuing our warp videos by having a look at warp travel. Now warp travel isn't something that's specifically covered by the Warhammer 40,000 main lore, it's mainly covered in the books and background lore and so requires a little bit more explanation as well as having a look at maybe my last video in order to get some clarity before I proceed. So the main way of travelling through the warp in the 41st millennium, for the Imperium at the very least, is a warp jump. Now a warp jump consists of a ship having to enter the warp from real space by activating its warp engine, which is different from its standard engine that it uses to move around conventional space. Once it's in the warp, it uses its conventional engines to travel just as it would do in real space, and then uses its warp engines again once it's reached its destination in order to re-emerge from the warp into real space. Now this process is known as a jump or hop, and actually entering or exiting the warp is known as a drop, a shift or a transition, which is the most common word used in the 41st millennium. Now, as mentioned in the last video, the warp doesn't follow the normal laws of physics, and it is ever moving with inconsistent currents and tides, so the exact nature and location of the exit for long distance jumps is often unpredictable. Smaller jumps of up to about 4 or 5 light years, as I mentioned in my last video, are generally accurate, while longer jumps can be very dangerous. Now it's easier to travel from some systems where well-established trade routes and well-charted warp currents have been set up due to long-standing trade within the Imperium. Now to add further unpredictability, there is a drastic difference in time between warp and real space. Time passes at a very variable rate in warp space, as I mentioned before. Only once a ship jumps out of the warp can it learn how long the journey actually took. Generally, however, 1 day in the warp can relate to about 12 days real time, although of course that's a very rough figure. Sometimes ships and fleets within the warp can be caught in time bubbles for hundreds if not thousands of years, emerging outside of the warp thinking they've only been in for a short period of time, but actually everything they've known has completely changed and the Imperium has moved on. Now entering the warp can, like many things, further disturb the fabric of the warp, like a drop of water entering a pond. Often warp jumps can give away the position of ships to other ships either within or without the warp, and will allow them to home in on its location. Now, there are two ways of achieving a warp jump, a calculated jump and a piloted jump. So what I'll do is I'll talk about the calculated jump first. Now these are shorter jumps, as I mentioned before, and they're carried out by calculating the ship's projected course, factoring in corrective manoeuvres, an approximate journey time, and the exit point before it starts the warp jump. Now, while a ship is in real space, its warp drive is actually connected to the warp, and so has the ability to monitor that part of the warp corresponding to the ship's current position, and observe how the warp is flowing. However, this monitoring can only be done in real space. Once the ship is in the warp, it's actually attached to the current and so can't see how it passes. This means once inside, there is no longer any way to predict the movements of the warp, and all the ship can do is rely blindly on what it projected before entering the warp, until it emerges in real space, and they have to hope they arrived in the precise location. Generally, it's quite safe to jump a very short distance, as I mentioned 4 or 5 light years, but any further than that runs a high risk of getting lost or trapped within the warp. Now the better method of travelling by the warp is piloted jumps. Now these are for longer jumps of up to about 5,000 light years, and this can be done by a ship steering through the currents of the warp whilst inside the warp. Only the navigators, which are human mutants who have received a genetic third eye, who I mentioned in one of my early videos, have the ability to look into the warp and actually see currents, as opposed to just a roiling madness which will drive them insane. Now within the warp they can see and sense the Astronomicon, a powerful psychic beacon that is centred on Terra and is used as a sort of navigational reference aid by judging its distance, strength and position, so they can inform the ship's captain to adjust heading when the ship is forced off course by warp currents. However, piloted jumps still remain unpredictable and dangerous, as the Astronomicon's power, although immense, is limited to a diameter of about 50,000 light years from Terra. Also, warp storms and other warp disturbances can disrupt or block the beacon. Now, the limitations of warp travel are many, and I'll just mention some of the major ones here. Now, ships coming out of the warp must appear some distance away from a gravity well in deep space, otherwise they risk destruction amongst the graviton surges inside a gravity well. Because of this, many civilized worlds have located jump beacons, which allow a ship to know the extent they need to go before entering the warp. Now unfortunately this means that ships who want to ambush ships coming out of the warp or going into the warp can wait at this location for ships to re-emerge and then bombard them whilst they're still recovering from warp space. As I mentioned, there are also other dangers within the warp, as of course the warp is populated by demons and other warp entities who seek to corrupt humanity and destroy the interlopers, which could be seen as the ships travelling through space. Now, warp-faring species have invented many warp-repelling barriers in order to prevent demons from accessing their ships. The human version is of course known as the Geller Field, which allow races from the material realm to traverse the warp. Now, many races have many different methods of travelling. The Imperium has the method I just mentioned, as do some of the races who rely on similar methods of technology, such as the Orcs, who use scavenged Imperial technology most of the time to travel through the warp, so they use a version of a Geller Field. However, there are other races, such as Demons, Eldar and Tyranids, to name a few, who have different methods of warp travel, and I'll go over them now, although the detail will be left for this race's specific video overview. To start off, I'm going to mention warp rifts. Now, these are also known as warp portals, as I mentioned in my last video, and these are points in real space that intersects with the warp in a form of a stable exit and entry point, where the use of warp drive is not required. Now, the Enslavers, which are one of the most ancient type of warp entity, were known to use warp rifts to travel between the warp and real space. However, the exact nature of these portals or rifts is not understood by the Imperium. Some warp rifts can occur randomly. Other times, the Chaos Gods or mortals manufacture them, as I mentioned in my last video. Some last for moments, some last for days, and some can last for millennia. The permanent large-scale warp rifts that are known to the Imperium are things such as the Eye of Terror and the Maelstrom, which provide safe haven for Chaos cultists and worshippers within real space due to their intersection with the warp. Now, another method of warp travel, and although I'm not going to go into detail, it is a major method of warp travel, is the Webway. Now, the Webway was created by the Eldar, and it's a series of portals or tunnels which were created at the height of their empire before their consumption by Slaanesh. Now, they were placed a very long time ago throughout the galaxy and on Elder craft worlds, and each gateway is a point in real space linked to another point in real space by a warp tunnel that is protected from the hostile nature of the warp because it exists between the two realities but not entirely in either. Now, journeys through these tunnels can be made in fixed time, and so don't rely on the changing time of the warp. And the arterial tunnels are large enough to carry spacecraft, although most tunnels only accommodate human-sized creatures or small vehicles. And the Webway is ancient and it is degrading since the fall of the Elder Empire, which means some passageways and gateways are lost or broken. Some have been discovered by the Imperium and are referred as warp gates, and become of vital importance to move objects around safely, although why they exist or who constructed them is a mystery to the humans. Such gates are of course extremely rare. Also, on a side note, the Dark Eldar home city of Komorga is actually located within the Webway, in a giant crossroads, which was originally designed as a home of the Eldar Empire, but is now home to the Dark Eldar, the Dark Kin of the Eldar. Now, it must be mentioned that the Emperor was working on access to the Webway and creating his own Webway when he was accosted by Horus during the Horus Heresy, and it is one of the reasons why he must sit upon the Golden Throne, to maintain the barriers between his Webway, which is now infested by demons, and Earth. Of course, if he ever got off this Golden Throne, of course he can't, but if he did, it would mean that the link would be severed, and the warp would be able to access Earth directly, of course meaning almost total destruction for humanity, and the loss of the Imperium. Now, of course, many theories have been projected as to why the Emperor started this, but I won't go into any more detail about this topic until we move on to our Horus Heresy videos sometime in the future. Now, moving back to different methods of warp travel, the Tau are different, although they are one of the most similar methods of warp travel to the Imperium. They actually lack psychers, so are incapable of fully entering the warp. However, based on duplicating warp drives found from unknown alien vessels, they found a way of driving towards the warp, extending the field of the drive into a wing-shaped design to hold their vessels in the warp before being hurtled into real space again, like a ball held underwater and then released. Well, this is much slower, by a factor of 5 when compared to Imperial jump speed. It's a lot safer because they do not enter the warp deep enough to become exposed to any of its dangers. It's also more predictable as their speed works out at a constant rate. Nevertheless, the limited form of warp travel results in the Tau Empire being closely packed around the home system, as the ability to travel long range is restricted at this time. It is also theorised that the Necrons, although we don't know, use a very similar method of travel, as they do not actually use the warp either, because of course, being metal men, they have no access to psychers. However, we do not know exactly. It is possible, due to their age, they actually invented a different method of fast and light travel, so travel beyond the means of the warp and are able to get around almost as quickly as travelling through the warp. However, as I mentioned, we do not know at this stage, so until we know more, I will not press the issue. If anyone else out there actually has any sources which give us more specific evidence, do let me know and we can follow that up. Now finally today, I want to talk about the Tyranids. Now, the Tyranid hive fleets do not travel through the warp, but instead rely on small naval HAL bioships which are capable of harnessing a planetary system's gravity from immense distances away to create a corridor of compressed space through which the Tyranid vessels can travel towards a star system at a swift rate. Whilst slower than proper warp travel, the method is infinitely more reliable. On final approach to a system, the Naval's delicate senses face interference from multiple gravity sources, and so the fleet must resort to slower conventional propulsion whilst within the borders of a system, hence the idea of the fleet becoming a grasping claw as it exits the corridor and becomes spread out in a system. Now, that's everything I wanted to mention today on warp travel. As I've mentioned before, next week we'll be moving on to something on warp entities, and we'll be talking more about psychic powers before moving back onto the Space Marines and continuing our videos there. Now, thank you for listening. If you have any more suggestions, do not hesitate to leave them in the comments below, along with any questions, and if you have any more votes for the next Space Marines chapters videos, let me know. As always, I hope you enjoyed today, and we'll see you next time on the Vaults of Terra.